All right, Kurt, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for being on Zoom with me. It's a good thing it's not in person because I got COVID too. So my son's tested positive Wednesday and Saturday, and of course I keep testing negative, but I have all of their symptoms. So I'm assuming that I did not, accidentally get a completely different cold. But so I apologize if I'm a little bit hoarse or I occasionally have to wipe my nose. I'm in that fun stage of this, but fortunately it's nothing serious. So I appreciate the invitation, and I just want to reiterate that I'm happy to have people ask questions both during the talk and afterwards. If you need something clarified, if you have a question about something I said and you want to ask it, then go ahead. You can also feel free, if you want to make me feel at home, half of you can fall asleep and half of you can text during the lecture because I'll feel like I'm lecturing at the university. I am going to broadly lay out the relationship between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia up to the start of the war, and then just very briefly talk about what's happened since February 24th, and I'm happy to answer questions about what's happened since February 24th or what might happen in the future at the end as well. So I put up this map here just as a useful reminder to us where Ukraine is and the size, its extent, and a couple things about it. One is I do think it's easy for Americans to forget, especially people who grew up with the Soviet Union and didn't grow up with the idea of Ukraine being an independent country, how massive Ukraine is as a country, but also it's a location spanning from the Russian border to Poland and really into Central Europe. And I would also point out that the most important part of the map is what's just north of Ukraine is Belarus. So Belarus, I think, is really central to understanding how we got to the stage where Vladimir Putin decided to launch a war, or as he's calling it, a special military operation. Let's see, there we go. Make sure I move that forward. Okay, so the question that we most often get when people are asking about this war is, what are Vladimir Putin's goals, or certainly what were they in February? And I want to emphasize that there was a great deal of uncertainty around the world as to what Vladimir Putin was trying to accomplish. One of the strange perks of my job is because I teach US foreign policy. About 6 years ago, a reporter from Bratislava, Slovakia, started writing to me, asking me questions about American foreign policy. He would write every 6 months or so. And so in January, he wrote and asked me a question about US and Ukraine and Russia. And I gave him my answer. And at the end, I said, Andrzej, what do you think Vladimir Putin is trying to accomplish here? So this is a foreign affairs correspondent for a newspaper in Slovakia. And he said, I have no idea what Vladimir Putin is trying to accomplish. It didn't make any sense to him either. So I want to emphasize first the picture here of Vladimir Putin shaking hands with his neighbor, Belarus's President Lukashenko. It is fair to say that Belarus is a wholly owned subsidiary of Russia right now. Belarus is a country that is directly tied to Moscow. Lukashenko has made clear that he views himself as Putin's ally, and he's clearly the second banana in this relationship. And I believe that what Vladimir Putin wanted out of Ukraine was a similar relationship that he has with Belarus. You may remember about a year ago, before the war was on, the big story out of that part of the world was that Belarus had forced down a jetliner that was carrying two anti-Belarusian dissidents, internal dissidents, and basically the Belarusian government faked a bomb scare and first forced the plane down in their territory. And that was a huge outrage because it broke norms that had been established since the end of World War II about civilians and airliners. And there wasn't much anybody could do about it. Putin obviously was not troubled by it. Lukashenko was learning from him. Two other pieces on the slide that I think are important. There's first one is Vladimir Zelensky and Jens Stoltenberg giving the modern COVID handshake, the fist bump. Stoltenberg, of course, is the Secretary General of NATO. And at a certain level, there's no doubt that the budding relationship between Ukraine and NATO was a concern for Vladimir Putin. Under Ukraine's constitution, joining NATO is a constitutional goal of the government, as is joining the European Union. Now, NATO was not about to absorb Ukraine earlier this year, but clearly Ukraine wanted to move more towards the West, and that has bothered Vladimir Putin. And I think we saw in late 2021 a sign that he was actually more desperate. We just didn't, grasp it, he being Putin. Memorial, the image that I have there, is one of the oldest human rights organizations in Russia. It was founded near the end of the Soviet Union's period, and the goal of Memorial was to memorialize the human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. And then it continued as a human rights organization in Russia. Now, Vladimir Putin has made clear that he thinks the Soviet Union's decline was a huge tragedy. He called it the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, which is pretty remarkable when you consider the two world wars, 30 million people dying in China, the Holocaust, that he has the fall of the Soviet Union as a great geopolitical tragedy. And Memorial clearly doesn't think it was a tragedy because the whole point of it was to document the human rights abuses. In December, Putin, who had been waging war against Memorial for years, finally shut it down completely, disbanded it, which I think was a sign now in retrospect that he wanted to get rid of a potential source of opposition to his moves that he was about to launch in Ukraine. I think Vladimir Putin does have a vision of what he's trying to accomplish. And the analogy that occurs to me is like 1914 in Germany. In Germany in 1914, the strategists looked at Russia and France, the two neighboring countries that had huge armies, and said, by 1916, Russia and France will be too powerful for us to beat in a war, and war is inevitable. So we better start the war before 1916 or we're going to lose. And so the Germans took advantage of an opportunity in 1914 to start a war, which they came pretty close to winning. I think there's a certain similarity here with Vladimir Putin. I think he looked at the trends in Ukraine and concluded that Ukraine was getting further and further away from him. And if he didn't act soon, he would never have a chance to make Ukraine basically the new Belarus. But then there's the public justification that Vladimir Putin has used, because he hasn't talked that way. A lot of the Russian material that's been put out about this operation in Ukraine has been about denazification. And that was some of the things they were saying originally at the start of the war. It sort of faded away. And then about 2 weeks ago, they came back to it again when somebody pointed out, President Zelensky seen here holding a proclamation, is Jewish. Clearly, it's not a Nazi country. And the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, basically doubled down and said, well, Adolf Hitler had Jewish roots too. And it was really a remarkable thing. In fact, it was so remarkable that Vladimir Putin actually apologized for it, which is a rare thing. I can't think of anything else he has apologized for. Part of the denazification argument is, as you see from the postage stamps, there is a Ukrainian history of celebrating Stepan Bandera, who during World War II did in fact collaborate with the Germans and has some clearly fascist leanings. And he got put on a postage stamp. There are other ways in which they have celebrated him in Ukraine. And you may have noticed, if you followed the coverage of the war from Russia, they often refer to the Ukrainian soldiers as Banderites. So they're basically emphasizing that everybody in Ukraine is related to Stepan Bandera. Now, Bandera is a pretty complex figure. I don't think you can label the whole country Banderites, nor was he a fascist all the time, but that's there. The Ukrainians can't deny it. But at the same time, it is so over the top that, as this tweet indicates from the German government, going the Nazi route is very controversial. So you may, if you look at the tweet carefully, I wipe my nose and I apologize for that. The Russian embassies around the world were emphasizing this idea about denazification of Ukraine. And the embassy in South Africa did that. And the German embassy in South Africa basically said, shame, as it says at the end of in the parentheses, we are experts on Nazism, and the Ukrainian government is not Nazi. So it's such a ridiculous thing. The question is, why are they doing it if it doesn't work anywhere in the world? And I think it's for internal consumption. As you may have noticed, back on May 9th, Victory Day is a huge celebration in Russia, their memory of the victory in World War II. And you see the picture there has the collection of Russian soldiers on Victory Day, May 9th, 1945, holding a collection of Nazi banners. So by emphasizing denazification, they had a little bit with Stepan Bandera, but then they also had this history that they could point to and try to say to the Russian people, this is part of our legacy. We're cleaning out Ukraine on behalf of the legacy of all those Russian soldiers who died fighting the Nazis. Clearly not working abroad, but appears to have, at least early on, had some success at home. So how does the United States fit into all this? I think we have to go back to early in the 20th century to the first attempt by the United States to make itself a truly European power. because I think there's some centrality to understanding the American relationship with Ukraine. You see here Woodrow Wilson. He was president, obviously, during World War I. In January 1918, Wilson gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, the 14 Points Address. And the 14 Points Address laid out the future of American policy for the world. He hoped that this would be a model for the world, and included creation of the League of Nations. One of the core ideas that Wilson put out in 1918, 1919 was self-determination. And self-determination meant that a nation, a group of people defined by their nationality, should get to determine their future. And so the 14 points includes, for instance, the Romanians should have a Romanian state. The Turks should have a Turkish state. And so he defined these people by nationality. It's important to remember that, because the other model that was out there that was gaining traction in 1919 was define people by their class. This is what Vladimir Lenin was saying. Workers of the world unite, not workers of Russia unite, or workers of Germany or Germans unite, but workers unite. So Wilson had this alternative vision. So Ukraine, which you see on the map as a yellow piece, right sort of in the right of center, had not been independent for a long time. It had been part of the Russian Empire for centuries. In the collapse of the Russian Empire during World War I, Ukrainians decided that they were going to create their own country and be an independent Ukraine, and they thought they would get backing from the United States. In terms of morale, they did get backing. In terms of anything tangible, the United States did not back the idea of an independent Ukraine. There were too many other demands on Wilson's time. So from 1917 roughly to 1922, there were periods in which Ukraine was in fact an independent country. And eventually it was conquered by the Soviet Union and swallowed up, and partially the Ukrainians who were fighting to take Ukraine into the Soviet Union. So this was a very complex civil war. So that's the first attempt of the United States to set up sort of a global system that would recognize Ukrainian independence, and it failed. But World War II brought a very different story. And what we now talk of broadly as the liberal international order came along. So the United States led, for instance, the creation of the United Nations, which was basically Wilson's League of Nations, warmed over, and this time with the United States joining it. The United Nations has, in its charter, Article 2 is the key article. Article 2 says that all members of the United Nations agree that they will solve disputes among themselves amicably. You will not use force against another member of the United Nations. And if you do use force against another member of the United Nations, all the other members of the UN are obligated to come to the defense of that first state. Now, that doesn't mean they have to send military forces. They might do economic sanctions. But by joining the United Nations, you agree not to resolve your problems by force. And effectively, every country in the world has joined the United Nations. There are a couple of holdouts, but it's got 190 members right now. And that's a mark of becoming an accepted nation in the world, is to join the UN. At the same time that the US was leading the world in setting up the UN, it also set up a series of economic agreements at Bretton Woods, just up the road in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the Mount Washington Hotel. And you see John Maynard Keynes, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. There he is, sort of leaning over Harry Dexter White, who was a lot less influential as an economist, but had a much bigger bankroll behind him because he was the American government. And White led the negotiations to create things like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and what would eventually become the World Trade Organization in the 90s. All these were about economic cooperation. So this is the new post-World War II order. Countries cooperate economically, they don't conquer each other. They may have disagreements, but they resolve them through politics and diplomacy. And you try to bring all the nations of the world into one huge trading bloc so they won't want to fight each other. So jumping ahead to the 1990s, obviously the big holdout on that liberal international order was the Soviet Union and its allies, most of whom were allies only because they've been forced into alliance by the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, largely because of the doings of this man, Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev was about 55 years old when he took power. And I remember when I was young, people would say, oh, Mikhail Gorbachev is a young man. And I was, roughly 30. I was like, doesn't seem that young to me, or 25. Now that I'm 56 years old, I can see that Mikhail Gorbachev is a very young man to have taken power over the Soviet Union. A spring chicken, basically. Gorbachev tried to launch a set of reforms to save the Soviet Union from its own problems and failed miserably. In 1991, the Soviet Union broke up into its constituent states. You can see the 15 different republics that emerged from the Soviet Union. All of those states joined the United Nations. So therefore, all of those states agreed to solve their disputes peacefully. That includes Ukraine and Russia, both of which joined the UN. So this is the first thing, the dissolution of the USSR. Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer in East Germany when that happened. He was very unhappy to watch the Soviet Union dissolve. He didn't really have a job or a future at that point. The second feature of the 1990s was this question about nuclear weapons. So Ukraine, when it became independent, became the third largest nuclear power on Earth. It had 1,900 nuclear warheads in its territory. Now, Ukraine did not have the command and control system over those weapons. So it's not like Ukraine could suddenly just start launching missiles at Poland or Greece or whoever it wanted to. But it still had the weapons on its territory and it had a lot of smart engineers. So there might have been a way to eventually accomplish that. And the picture of the sort of Amtrak with a missile there, I guess you wouldn't complain about it being late under those circumstances. This was a Ukrainian-built missile. So the Ukraine had a stake in in this nuclear arsenal. In 1994, Ukraine made a deal with Russia, Britain, and the United States that it would hand all of its nuclear material over to Russia in exchange for assurances about the boundaries of Ukraine, that they would not be encroached upon by any of the neighbors. And you see President Kravchuk here on the right, shaking hands with Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, and President Clinton for the United States. President Kravchuk just passed away in Ukraine. There was actually a big funeral for him because he was the first president of an independent Ukraine after the Soviet Union. So the 1994 Budapest Agreement, Boris Yeltsin, on behalf of Russia, accepted the boundaries of Ukraine as they were drawn at the end of World War II, basically as part of the Soviet Union. One of the key things about the Budapest Agreement, though, is that the language is assurances and not guarantees. So a guarantee means you actually have to come up and like Britain and the United States would have to fight for their Ukrainian borders. An assurance simply means that you will work to protect Ukraine, but that might be through diplomacy. In any case, Russia, Article 2 and the Budapest Agreement had through two ways accepted Ukraine's post-Cold War boundaries. And the third part of the story for the 1990s, of course, is NATO expansion. So NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is the black states here, 1949, were the states that founded the organization, including Canada and the United States, which are obviously off the map. I always get a kick out of the fact that they thought Italy was in the North Atlantic. Somebody obviously had failed geography when they were putting together the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but there's Italy too. NATO actually grew out of a European desire for common defense. The three countries that started the process to founding NATO, people often think, well, it must have been Britain and France. It was Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, the Benelux countries, as they're called. It sounds like a vacuum cleaner, but three very small countries in Europe who wanted to first create a common defense with the hope of bringing the bigger countries in with them. So in 1949, they created NATO, and NATO had as its key Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. So everything from Denmark and Luxembourg to Portugal to the United States, they all agreed to defend one another. And while in the long run, NATO has been seen as an anti-Soviet alliance, it was also in 1949 a way of keeping an eye on the Germans, because that was the more recent threat to these countries, a rearmed Germany. They'd already seen Germany lose one war and come back 20 years later. They were not convinced that Germany was destined to be an ally. So the joke in 1949 was that NATO kept the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. So it had a common goal. But as you can see from the map, in 1955, West Germany officially joined NATO. So West Germany became the backbone of the Western defense system. Germany still had a pretty big military at that point, and the troops were needed if the Russians were to ever invade.
Okay. We do have a question from the chat. It says, what is Turkey's issue with Sweden and Finland joining NATO?
So that particular issue is that Sweden and Finland, so the Turks have a long-running battle internally with Kurds. So if you look at the map of Turkey here, which is bright blue, is a 1952 edition with Greece. The Kurds live in eastern Turkey, and then you see Iraq and Iran down there, also bordering it to a certain extent Syria. The Kurds live in that area. The Kurds have been basically in a civil war with the Turkish government since, I think, the 1970s. And the Turks view the Kurds as terrorists almost by definition. And meanwhile, other people in Europe and the United States view the Kurds in places like Syria as freedom fighters. And in any case, if they've left Turkey, as people in need of asylum. So Sweden and Finland have both agreed that Kurds who have left Turkey, in effect, have a right to asylum, meaning that they've been persecuted, and their political organizations are legitimate political organizations, which the Turks absolutely don't accept. So President Erdogan of Turkey does not want to accept he's making. I don't think he'll block Finland and Sweden, but I think he's making a point, and he'll back off at some point, but he's going to make Finland and Sweden sweat a little bit. And I'm happy to elaborate more if people would like to ask questions. It's a good time because of the expansion of NATO question is very live. So you see on the map that West Germany joined, the blue country, and then next to it, bright green, is East Germany. So when Germany, at the end of World War II, was divided, it was into East and West Germany. East Germany, in 1955, the same year West Germany joined NATO, East Germany was part of the formation of the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was basically a Moscow-based alliance to counter NATO. And it was going to be the Eastern European countries that Moscow occupied. When the Berlin Wall was opened in November of 1989, Germany was going to reunite East and West Germany, and there was a huge discussion. Would Germany, a united Germany, be in NATO? Would it be neutral? It wasn't going to be in the Warsaw Pact, that was for sure. And Mikhail Gorbachev and James Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, had a discussion. And originally the agreement was that East Germany would join Germany, but there would be no NATO troops in East Germany, and nobody else would join NATO. But Baker got Gorbachev to agree to the principle that independent countries have the right to choose their own allies. And that would mean that countries throughout Europe could choose to join NATO if they wanted to. And Gorbachev had to accept, if he was consistent, that was a legitimate point to make.
Oh, there's just a follow-up question in the chat. It just said, it says, thank you, but I don't understand the Kurds' influence on Scandinavia.
Well, it's not that the Kurds are particularly numerous, but every country has to recognize people who are seeking asylum under various international treaties. So if you are a Kurd from Turkey who has fled Turkey and ended up in Sweden or Finland, you would have to go through the normal process of applying for a residency, or you could claim you're fleeing danger in Turkey, which is a pretty easy case to make. If you're a Kurd in Turkey, you don't really have a lot of standing. So there aren't a lot of Kurds in in Sweden or Finland, but the governments of Sweden and Finland have recognized, and not alone, I mean, the governments of Norway, Denmark too, that the Kurdish political organizations are legitimate political organizations. Therefore, the Turkish attempt to break them is reasons for asylum. So basically, the Turkish government says these Kurdish organizations are terrorists. The Swedes and Finns say, no, they're not. They're people who are just exercising the legitimate political rights. So what Turkey's saying to Finland and Sweden is, we'll let you join NATO if you change your policy on the Kurds who have escaped Turkey and treat them as terrorists the way we think you should. And then they wouldn't have rights in Finland and Sweden. They would be basically like if somebody from, maybe not Al-Qaeda, but if somebody from a terrorist organization came to the United States and the US thought that was a terrorist organization, they'd be arrested and sent back to their home country. So that's what the Turks want. I think they realize the Finns and Swedes aren't going to do that, though.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Gorbachev accepted the principle that East Germany would merge into West Germany and that NATO would include all of Germany. And that, of course, opened the door for the rest of Eastern Europe to decide whether to join NATO or not. So as you can see from the map, 3 countries in particular were deemed pretty good candidates to join NATO. Poland, the largest green country, the Czech Republic right below it, and then Hungary, which is sort of 2 countries below that. and all of them joined NATO in the 1990s. There was a huge argument in Europe and the United States whether or not to expand NATO. Did NATO have a mission anymore? And all three of those countries, the government said, absolutely, NATO has a mission. Russia might be down on its luck now, but Russia has a long history. Russia will be back, and we want to be in NATO. The joke about the Warsaw Pact that they had been in before was that the Warsaw Pact is the only alliance in history that exclusively attacked its own members. And so countries like Hungary and the Czech Republic remembered when Warsaw Pact soldiers, mainly Russian soldiers, marched into their cities and crushed rebellions. They wanted to get into NATO. So the picture we have here is of the NATO's 50th anniversary meeting. And at that meeting, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were formally welcomed into NATO. And most importantly, the principle of eastward expansion was ratified. And you can see some of the other light green countries that joined over the next few years, and then there are other shades of yellow to suggest other countries that have joined over time. So the idea that Ukraine might join NATO was not ridiculous. In fact, in 2008, the United States pushed Ukraine to join, for NATO to accept Ukraine, but NATO was not ready to do it. But it's important to note that the NATO countries recognized that people around Europe were worried about this. And so NATO created the Partnership for Peace. The idea was to open up NATO. It's a military alliance, but it would allow the Russians and anybody else who were remotely close to NATO territory to have access to NATO meetings, to consult with NATO governments, so there would be no surprises. You know, the reality is, despite what Vladimir Putin says, NATO is not in any way an offensive military force. The biggest army by far is the German army. The German army is not an offensive force. In 2001, I was in Germany talking to a friend of mine, and so this was not long after the NATO expansion. And I said, so what's the state of the German army? He said, you have to understand, Germany has a state-of-the-art army for 1968. And his point was that Germany had not modernized, it had not built up. There was no offensive capability. So the idea that NATO was somehow going to attack Eastern Europe or attack Russia was just ludicrous. But the idea was to make sure that Russia understood what NATO was doing. And you'll see countries like Sweden and Finland, anybody who's neutral in Europe could join the Partnership for Peace and cooperate with NATO. So that brings me to Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin was pretty obscure when he became president of Russia in 1999. He was not a well-known figure. You see the picture of him in the background, of Boris Yeltsin in the background. Yeltsin, who was a freely elected, democratically elected president of Russia, had a very rough decade in the 1990s. It was a hard time being president. He was drinking quite a bit. His health was terrible. He basically appointed Putin as his successor. There was a quick election. Putin won it in 1999, probably won it legitimately too, and became president of Russia. And he was going to serve 2 terms. And at first, the world leaders tried to cooperate with him. So the picture in the upper right, you see Putin in the middle of a bunch of world leaders, Japan, Germany, France, the United States. They're all yucking it up. It's the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II. You know, this is clearly a time for thinking about the future. If the German and Japanese prime ministers can be there, celebrating with the Russian, and French, and American. So here they are trying to cooperate. And you may remember that George Bush was asked about meeting Vladimir Putin. And Bush said, I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul. And I know that I can work with Vladimir Putin. He's a good man. John McCain, who was one of Bush's rivals in the Republican Party, said, I looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes and I saw a K, a G, and a B, because he's still a spy and he always will be, and we should be careful about him. But Bush, as president, felt compelled to make peace with Putin to the best extent that he could. Still, when Bush left office in 2009, Russian-American relations were very rocky for a variety of reasons it would take a while to get into, but they were rocky. The Obama administration came in believing that it was imperative to have good relationships with Russia. Russia was the largest nuclear power on earth. There were all sorts of other issues. Russia produced oil. There needed to be a good relationship. And so the new Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, when she went to meet the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, brought him this reset button. We're going to restart our relationship. We're going to forget what's happened in the Bush years and try to focus on what we can do together. So an attempt to cooperate as Vladimir Putin held on to power more deeply over that first decade. Putin has become basically a dictator of Russia. He won the first election freely, probably won the second election freely, then stepped down because the Constitution required him to step down after 2 terms, but made himself prime minister and then came back and ran and has basically altered the Constitution so he can be president for life. And it's clear that as he has consolidated power, one of the things he has done is broken all sources of opposition internally to him. So there's very little that goes on in Russia that's not in some ways directed by Putin or his followers. So I don't know that Putin has evolved so much as he's just become more open because there aren't many opposition forces in Russia anymore. He can pretty much say or do what he wants, and his distrust of the West has only become more direct because he doesn't have anybody else to worry about internally. So he was in power in 2013, 2014, when Ukraine first really started to move away from Russia. Ukrainian domestic politics have been very messy. It's a new democracy since 1991. There have been people in and out of power. The country has shifted from pro-Western to pro-Russian, back and forth. In 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, so you see there in the middle, was the president. He was very openly pro-Russian, a friend of Vladimir Putin's. The Ukrainian government had been negotiating a deal with the European Union to move closer economically to the European Union. And then Yanukovych at the last minute decided that the deal was not what he wanted to do. So he backed out of it, and it created these huge protests in the big cities across Ukraine. And you see on the sign the person is holding in the front, "We support European values, freedom, democracy, human rights, and justice." So there was a pro-Western contingent in Ukraine that thought that that's what they had been trying to get to, and then Yanukovych had pulled them away from it. The Euromaidan protests that broke out in 2013 were largely peaceful, but there was violence. 100 people died in protests in various cities, fighting between government forces and rebels. And finally, Yanukovych decided that he could not hold power anymore, and he absconded with a fair amount of the state treasury and went into exile in Russia. And Ukraine held new elections and elected Petro Poroshenko, who was a pro-Western leader. And so at that point, Ukraine has been on the path to this more pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-NATO policy. But of course, 2013-14 was also when Vladimir Putin made his move to take advantage of Ukrainian chaos. So you see the map in the sort of yellow and blue, the Crimean Peninsula. Crimea, of course, has a long history in the Russian Empire, and you can see it on the inset map, the red piece. It had been part of Russia in Soviet maps until 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev redrew the map and included it now in Ukraine. So when Ukraine became independent in 1991, Crimea was included as part of Ukraine. If you look at the gray and white map that's on the right side, that charts percentage of Russian-speaking people. This was as of a few years ago. I'm sure it's changed since then, but before 2014. And you can see that the Crimean Peninsula, roughly 3/4 of the people speak Russian as their first language. There are a lot of people with Russian ancestry. And around Sevastopol, it's nearly 9 out of 10 people who speak Russian first, which means they're more likely culturally Russian than Ukrainian. During the middle of the chaos in Kyiv, there was a rebellion, and I use the term loosely, in the Crimean Peninsula, clearly pulled off by the Russian special forces. They created a new government, held a referendum that was clearly fake, said that 90% of the people in Crimea had voted to join Russia, and they annexed Crimea. This is completely against Article 2 and the Budapest agreements. But while no Western country recognized the annexation of Crimea, the Russians had effectively annexed Crimea. And then you see the two provinces in the far east with the 68.8, 74.9. Those provinces also had a revolution that broke out, again, pushed by Moscow. And those two areas have declared themselves separate. Together, we call them the Donbass region. And they have been the source of an on-running civil war since 2014 between the Ukrainian government, which is trying to reassert authority, and Russian-backed rebels who are trying to get Russia to recognize their independence. So a lot of people thought in 2014 and 2022 that the point of the Russian buildup was to get Ukraine to recognize these territories as Russian and not Ukrainian. So here's a map that shows the Donbass region with the stripes in it. You see Donetsk and Luhansk over in the eastern part. It is worth also noting that 2014, this chaos led to the shooting down of an airliner, the Malaysian airliner that flew from the Netherlands flying in the direction of Australia and Malaysia, was shot down by Russian separatists using Russian anti-aircraft weapons. So the Ukraine crisis was not limited just to Ukraine. It became an international incident as well. Now, the big thing that's changed since 2014 is that the US government has stepped up its military aid. So the Obama administration had tried to offer just humanitarian aid to the Ukrainian government, not wanting to see the war spiral out of control. After 2014, largely at the urging of Congress, aid to Ukraine expanded pretty dramatically. And most importantly, what expanded was Western armies went in and started training the Ukrainian army. I think it's pretty clear that the Russian army is pretty poorly trained. The Ukrainian army was built on the Russian model. It was an old Russian army, basically. And US forces have been going in since 2014, as well as other Western Europeans, and training the Ukrainians in their own tactics. One of the things I read early in the war that surprised me that I'd not heard before was that the American plan for defending Western Europe was to let the Soviet tanks crash through the front line and then squeeze off the logistics. And then, basically when the tanks ran out of gas and ammunition, they'd be easy targets. Well, that's a hard thing to do. You have to be trained to let enemy tanks go by and stand your ground. But the Ukrainians apparently did that pretty well at the start of this war. And I think that's a testimony to the training they got from the Western armies. Of course, US aid that Congress approved was also at the center of the first Trump impeachment. You may remember the phone call between President Zelensky and Donald Trump shortly after President Zelensky was elected. And the key moment in the conversation came when he said about those Javelin missiles, which almost nobody in the United States had heard of, but now everybody's heard of, anti-tank weapons. And Donald Trump said, well, first, I need you to do me a favor, right? So this was aid that Congress had approved, lethal aid. And the question was, when would the Trump administration release it, under what circumstances? So US aid had ramped up pretty dramatically after 2014, and particularly military aid under the Trump administration, although it got wrapped up in the politics of the Trump campaign against Biden. So that brings us to this immediate crisis in the winter of 2021-22. You've probably all seen pictures of Vladimir Putin meeting his advisors. He's at one end of this very long table, and they're at the other end. It's even created an internet joke. The newest IKEA table, the Putin, is 40 feet long with two chairs at either end. Putin has been notoriously concerned about getting COVID and trying to keep people at a distance. But he's also, I think, increasingly concerned about people around him, that he wants people he can control, not people who will give him honest answers. Shortly before the invasion in February, he had this National Security Council meeting, which you see the picture of. These are his closest advisors, and I use closest loosely, given how far away they are from him. And in particular, Sergei Narishkin, who is the equivalent of the CIA chief for Russia, he got up to the podium, which you can sort of see in the center of the stage to the right of the statue. And he said, maybe we should give our diplomats some more time to work with the West to solve what the dispute in Ukraine. And it was a very measured criticism of Putin's policy. He didn't say you're doing this wrong. He didn't say we should back off in Ukraine. Just let's see if there's another way to get our interests. And Putin just eviscerated him on national television, basically reduced him to a puddle by saying, when you're done, sit down and shut up. And when I saw that, it's crystallized in my mind something from 1946, when George Kennan here, who had been a U.S. U.S. diplomat in Moscow, wrote the famous long telegram, 8,000 words, explaining Joseph Stalin. This one sentence in particular, it may be small on your screen, so I'll read it, where Kennan wrote, "I, for one, am reluctant to believe that Stalin himself receives anything like an objective picture of the outside world." I think Vladimir Putin convinced himself this was going to be a cakewalk, and nobody around him was willing to tell him that the West might stand up for Ukraine and that Ukraine might stand up for itself, because they're afraid of him. If you tell him something he doesn't want to hear, he just gets rid of you. And gets rid of, in Russia, obviously means being sent off to Siberia. It sometimes means being killed. There was a political opponent who was killed on the bridge outside the Kremlin in 2015. There's nothing to be gained by disagreeing with Vladimir Putin.
Oh, this actually might be a good time because there was a question in the chat. So
Yes.
going back to the 2014,
Yes.
how could Putin miss all the support given to Ukraine after 2014? This actually going to relate to his aides can't be blamed for missing the obvious, and I think you kind of sort of probably answered that.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is until the army was actually tested, nobody knew if the training was going to take and in Ukraine, right? I think even the Western countries who have been trying to support Ukraine, most of them didn't think Ukraine was going to survive this war. Some of the Germans have been very open, saying, we didn't think you'd last 3 or 4 days. And I think there was a widespread assumption, even among Ukraine's allies, that Ukraine would probably lose Kyiv and Kharkiv and maybe even just collapse. I think the other thing to keep in mind is the collapse of the Afghan government was on a lot of people's minds, a government that people thought maybe, had a little more fight in it, but it collapsed right away. What if the Ukrainian government had similar lack of fight? So, and I think we also have to remember that in December, January, President Zelensky's approval rating was very low. The main thing he was doing was fighting Petro Poroshenko and trying to get Poroshenko thrown in jail for corruption. So here were these two, the leader and the guy he replaced, fighting each other about who was more corrupt. So I think there was reason to be doubtful about whether or not that had taken effect. But I also think that if the Russians had actually studied the Ukrainian army, they might have said, they're not going to welcome us as liberators, and we need to be prepared for a real fight. So it is. I mean, I think one of the questions we'll have to answer, it may not be for 30 or 40 years till we get access to the Russian archives, is what was Vladimir Putin seeing? What were the people around him telling him? My guess is those people in the National Security Council, that they had a pretty good sense of what was going on in the world, and that the United States and its European allies were actually going to back Ukraine. But the people sitting in that room were not about to tell Vladimir Putin that, because then they wouldn't get to sit in the room anymore. And sitting in the room gives you access to wealth and power and prestige. So the price of being wrong would be pretty great, and the price of being right might be even worse, right? So I think at that point, they just tell Vladimir Putin what they want. I could be wrong about this. Those of you with college-age kids may appreciate this, but at the last day of class, my foreign policy class this semester, I suggested that Putin was not adequate, did not have an objective view of the outside world. And two of my students immediately said, "We don't believe that at all." So I think there's a matter of some discussion. But I think it's also clear that the Russian government did not expect what happened. First of all, I don't think they expected the sanctions slapped on them by the Western powers would actually be put on, and that they might be effective. So if you look at this chart of the value of the ruble, you can see that it took a hit in 2014 when there were some sanctions put on, but it stabilized after 2015 or so. But then the sanctions in 2022 destroyed the ruble, and the Russians claim the ruble's back, but you can't trade it for anything, so nobody knows what the ruble's really worth. The sanctions also did one of the things they were really supposed to do, which was to create internal dissent. The thing is, sanctions almost never change a government's policy. I mean, we're still basically sanctioning Cuba since 1960, and Cuba has not really changed its policies. Iran, we've been sanctioning it since 1980. It has not really changed its policies. So sanctioning does not really change the government's policies. And part of what a sanction is supposed to do is create hardship on the people in the country so that they are unhappy with their governments. And I think really it's to encourage people to overthrow their governments. If you're a billionaire, sanctions might cost you some money, but you're probably still going to be a billionaire, or at least like a 500 billionaire. You'll still be wealthy enough that they won't really hurt you. But if your savings account is 5,000 rubles and the ruble collapses, then you're really affected. And we did at the beginning of the war see a surprising number of really brave people in the streets protesting the war, and basically the Russian government cracked down on them. And I think those protests have largely faded away, or turned into the sabotage acts we're seeing that are kind of mysterious. Whether those are Ukrainian or internal Russian is hard to say. So when Russia invaded on February 24th, I think one of the surprises it had was that the Ukrainian army fought a lot better than anybody expected it would. and maybe that the Russian army fought worse than anybody expected it to. But the other thing is the number of countries around the world that stepped up, not just with sanctions, but with military aid. And is looking at the map of Europe, most of the countries of Europe have handed military aid over to the Ukrainian government, sometimes in really staggering amounts. The government of Estonia has turned over a remarkable amount of its military equipment to the Ukrainians. And so I think this is what Russia did not anticipate, was a double whammy of the Ukrainian army being much better trained than it had been in 2014 when the Russians pushed it around pretty easily. And then the fact that so many European states and the United States would work in concert to support Ukraine as it fought. So I just want to wrap up with one thing. People always ask, how can I help? So I'll give you two quick links if you want to. We had a speaker on campus about a month and a half ago who is well connected to Ukraine. She was talking about something completely different, but talking to her, she said, well, this is where I help, was to go to Razom for Ukraine, and it does everything from humanitarian aid to military aid, and she spoke very highly of it. One of my colleagues at UNH, Olivia Babin, has set up a GoFundMe page because she still has 3 brothers in Kyiv who are ministers who are trying to help people in and around Kyiv. So back when the Russians occupied areas around Kyiv, they were going out into the countryside and finding people who were immobile and bringing them back to Kyiv so that they could be taken care of without the Russian army getting them. They were using a borrowed van that got hit by an artillery shell. By a remarkable coincidence, nobody was hurt, but the van was riddled with shrapnel. They actually have a picture of it on her GoFundMe page. So they're trying to raise some more money to get a van of their own. So if it gets damaged, at least they're not using borrowed vans. Obviously, the pressure around Kyiv is not as great, but this war is going to drag on. And so Olivia has, these 3 brothers, 2 of whom are ministers who are helping. And in fact, her final sibling is a sister. Her sister and his sister's husband and their 3 kids drove out of Kyiv on back roads until they were able to get to the border to get out of the country. And it was just almost a miraculous escape because they had no idea where the Russian troops were. So they had to be very careful. And he was of military age, so they had to be very cautious. So if you're inclined to help, there are obviously lots of places to do it, but these are 2 I know that I think that I understand are very useful. So with that, I'll stop. I'm going to go back to the opening slide just because it's a good slide to maybe take questions on. And I'll take questions from the chat or from if you want to,
I was gonna say, we have one that just came in that I can read. Let me just find it. I've seen a lot of headlines about war crimes and prosecuting Russia or Russians about war crimes in the Ukraine. Will that make a difference in the current fighting?
I think the big difference it will make is the negotiation process. So the Ukrainian government, they've been negotiating since early in this war, which I don't know how you're a Ukrainian, you sit across the table from some Russians and shake hands and negotiate in good faith, but I guess that's what you have to do. It's pretty clear that the Ukrainian government plans on trying a lot of Russians for war crimes. And we've already seen one trial seems to have started in the last couple of days. I've only seen Ukrainian reports about it in English, obviously. I don't read Ukrainian, but so it looks like they're starting to try some Russian soldiers. And there's going to be a long list of Russian soldiers who are going to be able to be tried. So I expect that one of the things that they're going to have to work out in the negotiations with the Russian government, if they get to that stage of negotiating into the conflict, will there be war crimes trials and how are they going to be handled? Will the Ukrainians handle them? Will the Russians handle them? Will they hand them over to International Court of Justice? So I think that I think the Ukrainian government has an obligation to its citizens now to prosecute the war criminals. I don't think it can stay in power and say, well, we're gonna let the Russians go. I just don't think that's possible right now politically in Ukraine. But it's going to be a real stumbling block to a negotiated settlement. So the Ukrainian government may have to make a decision at some point. Will it basically stop the idea of war crimes prosecution in order to get a negotiated deal to get Russia off its territory? So I think there will be a lot more war crimes trials, but I wouldn't be surprised if they get dropped in the name of a diplomatic solution.
Another question just came in. What does actual NATO defense look like? If we woke up tomorrow and Ukraine was a member of NATO, what would what would be, sorry, what would be all the differences between current lend/lease?
Well, so first of all, to join NATO, to come back to the question about Turkey, there has to be unanimous agreement. So any one country could block a country from joining. And given Ukraine's status right now, Ukraine will not be accepted into NATO while the fighting's going on, because then we would immediately be at war with Russia. And the one thing the Biden administration has been very clear about from the beginning is it wants to avoid war with Russia. And it's been very crystal clear to the Russians about that too. And some people have complained that they should not have been so clear about that. So Ukraine's not going to join NATO until there's a peace agreement with Russia that the Ukrainians are happy with. But for Finland, for instance, if the Russians were to get some idea that they wanted to attack Finland now, then NATO does in fact have an agreement that countries that have applied for membership are considered under Article 5 protection while the process is undergoing, so that Russia can't say, well, Finland's not in, we'll attack you now, and then NATO won't come to defense. So basically, just by applying for protection, Finland has bought the guarantee, the Rule 5 guarantee, from the rest of NATO forces, including the United States. So a Russian invasion of Finland now would trigger a NATO response. Now, the only thing about that is the Russian army has been so badly chewed up in Ukraine. I don't think the Finns would need our help. I think the Finns would be more than able to defeat them. Of course, the real question is, what if somebody starts shooting missiles? And that's, if they start shooting missiles, it's going to be a very difficult decision for the other NATO members. Do we fire missiles back into Russia? Do we just send missile defense batteries to shoot down incoming missiles? Because nobody in Europe wants a wider war with Russia, because it would be so easy for Russia to make that a nuclear war. But at the same time, you can't let Russia fire missiles into NATO territory and let them get away with it, because then what's the point of NATO? And they can just fire missiles whenever they want. So, so far, the Russians have been remarkably reserved about the Finnish and Swedish decision to join NATO. And I think it's because they recognize they don't really have any bargaining power on that right now.
Another question, is there a good historical example of a country that was defended by NATO?
The only time Article 5 has been invoked was after 9/11. And therefore, the occupation of Afghanistan and the war in Afghanistan was a NATO operation. And so all NATO states were required to support it. And that's really been the only time NATO has been called upon to defend anybody. There were NATO forces in the fighting around Serbia when Kosovo tried to break off from Serbia. NATO decided that this was a European problem and NATO would intervene. But that was sort of to defend Kosovo, which was not a member at that point. It was to protect Kosovo from Serbian aggression. So I guess that would be a one time when a country was attacked. But yeah, nobody's tested the boundaries of actual NATO countries yet, and I don't think anybody will, because part of what's happened here is I think if people were wondering what was the point of NATO, that has been erased. Now we know why NATO needs to exist.
Another question, do you have a sense of how this conflict might end?
Oh boy, our slogan in the history department is "We predict the past." We're not very good at the future, but and we're not even that good at the past sometimes. I think so. I don't see any really good option coming out of this, but there are probably roughly three end games that would be plausible. The first is that there's a coup in Russia and Vladimir Putin is deposed by the Russian army, because I think that's the only force that would have the power to do it. And the Russian army basically says to the West and Ukraine, you know what, we didn't really want to do this. Just let us go home and we'll go home, and don't punish us, but we'll take care of Putin and his people, and we won't attack Ukraine anymore. And Ukraine might say, okay, fine, as long as we get our territory restored, you can go home and we'll forget about it. The second option is that the war drags on so long that the Ukrainian government comes to the conclusion that a negotiated settlement is the only thing it can do. And it negotiates for something less than full sovereignty over Crimea and the Donbass region. that would mean probably, I would think, 2 or 3 years of war. And we've seen how horrible this war has been in these cities. That's going to be a really bad situation. And it's going to probably break Ukraine as a functioning government. So the question would be whether or not Ukrainian people will basically tolerate a difficult situation and help rebuild their country. But that's, what could happen to Ukraine at that point is hard to predict. And then the third option is that the Russians say, enough of this assistance, somebody mentioned Lend-Lease, if the West is going to keep helping Ukraine, we're going to intervene against those Western shipments, and that provokes a wider war. And that's the worst outcome of all, right? Because a wider war, I think we have to assume, would become a nuclear war. I think, and I think the people in the Biden administration and other people in powerful places in Europe have also calculated that a wider war with Russia, the chances of it becoming nuclear are what percent? I was going to say what percent, but I think it's hard to put a tag on. But anything over 1% is too big of a risk, because we're talking about the end of civilization. So I think that's why they're trying everything they can not to provoke what the Russians might feel like they have to do to respond. I go back to, I talked about the Berlin Wall coming down. George H.W. Bush was president, and he's got this famous interview where he said, I resisted the urge to go over and dance on the wall because I would have been poking my eyes in the Soviet hardliners, and they would have had to respond. And so, even though it would have been a great PR moment to say, here's George Bush, the president of the United States in Berlin, that he had to play it cool. And I think at a certain level, that's what the Biden administration is doing too, that they don't want to provoke, if anything, they want the Russian army to turn its anger on Putin, not on the West.
Next question. Putin doesn't seem to respond with growing aggression. I'm going to start over. Sorry about that. Yeah. Putin doesn't seem to respond with growing aggression to the ever-changing situation. What is your take on why he is not escalating? And is he really considering nuclear war, or is he satisfied with just getting Eastern Ukraine?
I don't think he's seriously considering nuclear war, but at the same time, I think Vladimir Putin is first and foremost about his own survival. And if the Russian army actually gets pushed out of Eastern Ukraine, let's say not out of Crimea, but out of Eastern Ukraine, then his survival is going to be in doubt. There aren't a lot of power sources in Russia, but the Russian army is still powerful enough. If they're humiliated, I could see some high-ranking generals saying, well, as long as Putin's in power, we're going to take the blame. Let's get rid of him. And in that position, I think the problem Vladimir Putin has gotten himself into is he can't win the war. And how does he maintain power if he acknowledges defeat? And given all the enemies he's made around the world, he can't just retire. Like Vladimir Putin can't just go buy an island in the Caribbean or go to the south of France. For one thing, there are like 1 million Ukrainians who would hunt him down and kill him. So his life expectancy right now is pretty short. This assumes that he even has a long life expectancy. We see all these reports, maybe he's got cancer, who knows what to make of that. So I think Putin right now is scratching his head, like, how do I get out of this mess? I think even by now, obviously, he knows that they didn't capture Kyiv or Kharkiv and that they're getting pushed back. I would not be surprised if basically the negotiating positions he's saying to the Ukrainians is, we're just going to keep pounding your cities until you recognize that Crimea and the Donbass are independent and can join Russia. And I don't think the Ukrainian government can accept that right now. I don't think Zelensky can go back to the Ukrainian people and say, well, to stop the war, I signed away Crimea. In fact, just today, Zelensky doubled down by giving this speech about the exile of a certain population of Crimea, the Tatars, who were sent out in World War II, sent out to the east, and like a couple 100,000 of them died. So he was doubling down on this idea of genocide in Crimea has happened before. So it's really hard for him to back away from that. I don't think it could be months before he can back away from that. So I think right now Putin is searching for a way out. He doesn't want a nuclear war because then he's dead. But he might get to the point of desperation where I'm going to die anyway, so I'm going to take the West with me. And that's what I think we have to avoid. So he's tough to read right now because, he's desperate. He hasn't accomplished what he would hope to accomplish. And I read this story yesterday that he's making decisions at like the brigade level, which is like remarkably hands-on. That's sort of like Lyndon Johnson in 1968, making decisions about where bomb strikes would go in South and North Vietnam, because the war was going so poorly. He felt like, well, maybe if I take control, it'll go better. So I think Putin right now is licking his wounds, trying to figure out what he can do to get out of this, and is there any way he can negotiate a settlement with Ukraine? But that's going to be a political disaster for him, and that might be the source that gets him thrown out of power, in which case he's shortly after that dead.
I actually ended up skipping a question, so sorry, person who wrote this in. Can a current NATO country be expelled from membership? I'm thinking about authoritarian governments like Hungary and Turkey. I thought NATO countries are supposed to have fair democratic elections.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the process of, I mean, NATO has a whole set of things you're supposed to do to be a member. And there's never been an attempt to kick a member out. The EU has the same thing. There's a lot of talk about Hungary in the EU. So there's no doubt that Hungary.
I remember one of the reasons, and this was back in the mid-aughts when I was in college, that Turkey was not being blocked from the EU was its government, and it was nowhere near as authoritarian as it is now.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, Turkey really wanted to be a member of the EU, and it might be an interesting question. Had the EU welcomed them in, would there have been a different political path in Turkey? But Hungary was welcomed to NATO, and the Fidesz party has taken Hungary in a very different direction than what people expected. I was there a decade ago with the UNH program, and it was a really lively democracy with multiple parties fighting back and forth. And the idea that Viktor Orban would still be prime minister in 2022, I don't think anybody in Hungary would have predicted that, or that he would become this sort of dictator, because he was very much an anti-communist Democrat back when he was first in power. So I would have to go back and look at the NATO treaty. I mean, I'm sure there's a way, but the thing is, anything that NATO does like that would have to be unanimous. And I'm guessing that somebody like Slovakia would look at Hungary and say, there's got to be a better way than kicking Hungary out. And plus, kicking Hungary out would sort of shake NATO. Like, we took countries in, but we couldn't control them. So I think it's going to take a lot more to kick a country out. And for Turkey to exercise its right to block a new member, I don't think that's going to be, I don't think they can use that as grounds to expel Turkey or Hungary being difficult with Ukraine. But if the other NATO members get desperate, that might happen. But I think it would be really, really, I mean, I don't see it happening anytime soon, I guess is the way I'd put it.
I'm saying it's more of a comment, but it says it's a mind bender that the tiny Benelux countries created a group that was used only once to defend the largest member in a desert country of Afghanistan.
Yes. Yeah, that was not what they had in mind in 1948. And it's a fair question. That's not what NATO was formed for. So what is NATO all about? And, until this invasion of Ukraine, there were a lot of people who legitimately said, why do we even need NATO? There's no war in Europe. And suddenly we've got Finland and Sweden, of all people, the two most neutral countries in Europe outside of Switzerland, saying, oh, we want to be in NATO. We can't be neutral anymore.
Okay. Another question we have. I'm curious to know what your view on the stand of Russia in the world post this war, assuming the war goes one of the first two ways that you predicted.
You didn't know with a non-nuclear option? Yeah. I think that a number of things have happened to Russia. One is there were a lot of people around the world who watched Putin consolidate power and poison his enemies like Navalny and people like that, and the guy he poisoned in Britain. And they saw all that. They knew he was a terrible guy, but they thought, well, as long as he's keeping order and business can do business, what he does internally is his problem. We'll keep doing business with Russia. I think one of the things that's come out of this is that even companies that are willing to turn a blind eye to internal repression are now in a stage where they're saying, I'm not going to tolerate internal repression anymore. It is a problem for our shareholders. It's a problem for our customers, but it's also a problem for the rule of law, that if we do something that annoys Putin, he might just confiscate our property. So why would we want to risk doing business in Russia? And some of that has happened with companies that have tried to pull out of Russia. like the oil services companies have basically been finding that the Russians are just sort of taking their stuff when they try to break their contracts. So I think Russia is going to have a really hard time convincing anybody else to invest there for years to come. I mean, probably at least a decade. A lot depends on what, if the first one happens where the Russian army kicks Putin out, I could see a case where the Russian army basically says, you know, they lied to us, and we found out there's all this corruption, and we're going to clean it up, and we want to be a good citizen of the world, but you have to help us. I could see the countries of Europe saying, well, we've got to work with Russia because an angry Russia still has the most nuclear warheads in the world. So we have to have some way of working with Russia. So I could see in maybe 5 years' time, if the Russian army throws Putin out of power in the near future, that there is some sort of rapprochement between Russia and the rest of the world, particularly if the Russians make some sort of token to rebuilding Ukraine, like reparations, maybe throw a few people in war crimes trials to say, look, we're sorry about all this. I mean, we rehabilitated Germany really fast after World War II. We rehabilitated Japan really fast after World War II. Heck, let Italy change sides during World War II. So we can change our position pretty quickly if somebody is willing to basically say they're sorry. But since I think the more likely thing, or maybe an equally likely thing, is this sort of long grinding war in southern and eastern Ukraine, I think Russia is going to be cut off from the world for a long time. I just saw a tweet that I didn't have a chance to look at all the details, but it was somebody, you know, the source that I trust, basically saying that the biggest drop in Russian trade since February has come in trade with China. So one of the big things I think that's happened to Russia is they've proven that they're basically a paper tiger, and the Chinese, you know, we got this close relationship, and now they're looking like these guys can't even capture Eastern Ukraine. And Putin is clearly not a very good leader. I think there are a lot of Chinese officials and business people who are like, yeah, maybe Russia is not the partner we thought it was. So I think the Russian economy is going to be in the tank for a decade, maybe longer. And there won't be a lot of, you know, I don't know how anybody looks a Russian official in the eye after we know what they did outside of Kyiv. I mean, unless they're willing to take responsibility, nobody in the world is going to say, we forgive. Because at least the Germans after World War II took responsibility. So that's going to be the key question. Will anybody in Russia take responsibility for what happened?
We have 2 questions left. I think we might have to cut it off here because it is about 7:15 and we close at 8. The first question, I thought Ukraine applied to be part of NATO. Why is it so easy for some countries to join, but for others it's more difficult?
Okay, so NATO, in 2008, the US government has tried to get the other European states to agree that Ukraine could join. And Germany in particular thought it was a bad idea, that Ukraine wasn't ready to join NATO. Probably that was a reasonable judgment in 2008. So Ukraine has been careful not to apply because it would be even worse if they applied and it got declined. They did just start the process of joining the EU because the EU basically said, we're going to admit you. And so right now, NATO could not admit Ukraine because of the war situation. So it's easy for Finland and Sweden, partially because NATO has been sort of nudging Sweden like since 1949. You're closer to us than the Russians, why don't you join? And now the Swedes are doing it. And because neither Sweden or Finland's at war, it's easy to join them to NATO. So I think if Ukraine applied right now, it would have no chance of joining.
And the last question is it possible that Russia, China, and others would create a political coalition that would resemble the Cold War situation, but on a larger scale? Think I mean, the Russians, right before the invasion, the Russians and Chinese declared themselves, well, at least Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping declared them having I think it was an eternal friendship, something like that. It's a timeless friendship, which, you know, if you know anything about Russian and Chinese history, is hilarious. I mean, as recently as the 1960s, they were shooting at each other and killing thousands of each other on the border. The idea that they have this eternal friendship is just ridiculous. I think what's more likely to happen than this sort of alliance is that Russia becomes sort of a wholly owned subsidiary of China, because China's got the resources and the markets that if Russia needs help having access to the world and selling its oil, if the Europeans finally get around to cutting themselves off from Russian oil, the Chinese can use it, right? The Chinese are importing enormous amounts of raw materials. So I think, you know, probably the most likely outcome
is that Moscow is forced to change the orientation of its economy almost entirely to the Chinese industrial economy because it's absorbing so much resources. The Chinese have been talking about the Belt and Road. And one of the things about the Belt and Road is that when the belt gets wrapped around you, you don't get away from China. And I don't think they had visions of putting Russia in the belt, but I think they now have an opportunity that wasn't there a little while ago. So yeah, I could see an alliance between Russia and China, but I think it's going to be sort of a Warsaw Pact alliance where China is calling the shots and Russia is sort of, pretending to be independent, but not really independent. Now, again, if the Russian generals overthrow Putin, they might say, we do not want to be lackeys of the Chinese. I'm reminded of Ho Chi Minh's favorite saying that he would rather sniff French, we'll say dung, than eat Chinese dung. That being neighbors to China may help him in the war against France, but he did not want to be China's vassal. And I'm guessing there are a lot of Russian generals right now, if they're looking at the future and saying, we're going to be Chinese vassals? No, thanks. We'd rather overthrow Putin and see if we can make up with the West, because the West doesn't play hardball the way the Chinese do. That would be my guess.
Right. Well, yeah, it's about 7:50 right now. I would thank you very much for coming and for a great discussion and great questions, everybody.
Yes, excellent questions. And thank you for putting up for the drippy nose stage of COVID. Hopefully by tomorrow I'll be past this, and I'm sorry that you got it, but the show must go on. So.
Absolutely will. And yeah, thank you for powering through it. So thank you for everyone for coming. And if I was just saying, like, if you want to maybe just show us the how to help slide for anyone who might want to take a second look at it.
Yes.
All right, getting a lot of thank yous. So good job.
Very good. I appreciate it. There we go. So if Razum for Ukraine, or if you go to GoFundMe, Olivia Babin, you'll see her story and what they're trying to do. But she's a good person. I can vouch for her. I've known her for a few years on campus, and I just can't imagine what her family's going through in that first couple of months when Kyiv was under assault constantly, and she was just wondering what was going to happen to her brothers and her sister. But fortunately, her sister got out. But just to add, her sister and husband have 3 kids, and they moved in with Olivia and her husband, who also have, I think, 2 kids. Plus, Olivia's mom lives there, so they're like 10 people, or like 10 or 11 people crammed to this little house in Pembroke. But it's better than being under Russian shelling, so they're counting their blessings.
Right. Well, Professor Dorsey, thank you very much for your time tonight. And again, also everybody, I just want to say, as an international affairs major, y'all had great questions. So
yes, I agree completely.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a good night, and hopefully we'll see you at our next programs.
Thank you.
Have a good night.